Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about how to formulate a research question. So, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Mohammed Salman, Managing Director at Trillium Sciences, with experience in clinical research and working as a physician for more than 18 years. Pleasure to be with you all. So, this presentation is intended for junior doctors with still early experience with research or interest in research. So, what we're going to talk about today is what is a research question, and this is very important to start with. So, a research question is essential to guide you through your research paper. We always say that if you know your path and if you know where you're going, you can walk that path. However, not knowing that research question will lead you to uncertainty. And a lot of times we see colleagues and young researchers struggling with identifying the research question in the very beginning. So it's very important to formulate or find your research question because it pinpoints exactly what you want to find out, what and where do you want to go, and it gives your work a clear purpose and focus. So the researcher asks a very specific question or tests a specific hypothesis. That's the research question. So if you have a very specific question and you want a very specific answer to that question, you will get that answer through research. However, if your question is too general or uncertain or unclear, so that will lead you nowhere. Again, if you have a specific hypothesis and you want to prove it or disprove it, this also needs to formulate a good research question that will help you throughout the way to focus on your purpose. So, broad questions are usually broken into smaller testable hypotheses or questions. So, we usually, when formulating a research question and finding what we want to work on, we usually have a big idea or a greater idea, and then we break it down into smaller parts. So, how to choose a good research question? You start big, and then you narrow down your topic until you reach to the specific question. So, for example, if you can see the pyramid on the left, you will see that it's important to identify the big picture or the broad research topic. After that, you try to specify a subtopic in that big picture or a research topic. So narrow down the focus as much as you can, and then decide what's the nature of the inquiry. So you have to. I usually like to say that you have to answer the who, the what, the why, the how, and to be very specific when asking and when answering your research question, and then define the purpose of your study. After that, specify even more the research objective in one single sentence if possible. And we usually say if you can describe your research question in one question and you have to talk for minutes or hours in that, so you're not that specific and also you're too broad. So it's important to narrow down, as we mentioned, to develop a specific research question as mentioned. So as an example, if we're talking about genetic diseases in women, that's a very broad area and a disease area. So, and you have to narrow it down. So, if we want to narrow it down, we can narrow it down to women with single disease disorders. And then we can even further down to cystic fibrosis among women. So, that's a single gene and among women. And then we can even narrow it down to cystic fibrosis among female twins. So we have, for example, what's the prevalence of cystic fibrosis in female twins? What are the risk factors of cystic fibrosis among female twins? Also, for instance, in my field is pediatric nephrology. So if I have a broad topic, which is, for example, nephrotic syndrome, that's a huge topic, and you cannot ask a question that broad. So you have to narrow it down. So I'm going to talk about, for example, idiopathic nephrotic syndrome. So if we want to even narrow it down, so we're talking about idiopathic nephrotic syndrome in children, and then go to a specific point in that question. For example, what's the prevalence of idiopathic nephrotic syndrome in Egypt or UAE or England? So it's very important to take it step by step and do not keep your question broad. That's very important. So, what are the sources of research question? And this is very important. People think that, oh, yes, I have my research question and I know what I'm going to do. A lot of candidates and a lot of researchers are stuck at the research question for quite a long time. So it's very important to brainstorm. It's very important to keep talking and keep searching and look for your research question if it was asked before, or your question is a new question. So, first of all, you can always use your clinical experience when we're talking about doctors, we're talking about physicians, we're talking about pharmacists. It's very important to answer the questions that you get from your clinical experience and your clinical practice. So, for example, what's the efficacy of drug X in elderly, for example? So, you give that drug X to all the population, and it gives good results. However, you're not sure if it will give good results in elderly or even in children. So, it's very important to figure out the questions from your clinical practice, and we all get that in our practice. A lot of questions that we do not know the answer of. And that takes us to the next part. If you have a question and you don't know the answer, usually go to your mentor. And mentors have many years of experience and have many years of research experience and clinical experience. So going to them and asking, is this question valid? Can I ask this question? Can I make a research to answer this question? You may find a lot of answers or even different perspectives with this mentor that you haven't thought of. And then it's always important to be prepared and don't go to your mentor without reading literature. You will find everything you need in the literature, either local data, regional data, or even global on a global scale. So you have to figure out what your research question is through reading similar questions in the literature. Also, going to conferences and meeting colleagues is very important. Also, to listen to different perspectives and see what their ideas are on that specific topic and how they can make it easier for you to reach your research question. And the last part is having a team. It's very important that you have a team of colleagues, of biostatisticians, of writers, of researchers. It's very important to go through meetings, through groups, and brainstorm this research question. Is it valid? Can we look it up? Can we do a research to answer that question? And don't forget that there are ethical considerations you have to take into account before talking about a research question. So, what information to give before consent? And am I deviating from the normal clinical practice or not? What full burden will be imposed on participants? Because sometimes a research question can have a lot of risks. If I'm talking, for example, about a drug that is not approved, I cannot ask, for example, simply that I want to try it on children. You have to know what's the burden, and if there is a normal clinical practice that usually gives good results. What are the risks the participants or the patients will be exposed to? What benefit will the participants receive? And might publication reveal patients' identities or not? All these ethical considerations you have to put in mind when putting a research question, because it's very important not to start answering a question in an unethical way. So, how to formulate it? There are several ways. The most popular way is the PICO or PICO. Yani it's pronounced differently. PICO stands for P for population, patient or problem. Who are the patients? What's the problem? I for intervention or exposure. What to do? What do we do to them? And what are they exposed to? C stands for comparison. And are we comparing something to another? And the outcome, what happens when we give that intervention, and what's the outcome of this intervention? So, if we talk about the population from the example we just gave, if we're talking about idiopathic nephrotic syndrome, so my population is children, for example, children aged less than 18 years living in Egypt or North Africa, for example, with idiopathic nephrotic syndrome. And we can even be more specific in the types of idiopathic nephrotic syndrome. So that's our population. What's the intervention? So, for example, what if I give high dose corticosteroids to these patients versus low dose corticosteroids to these patients? So, these two steroid doses are the intervention or are the exposure that we expose our patients to. Sometimes it doesn't have to be a drug. It can be a surgery. It can be an intervention. It can be a test. Any intervention that is not in the usual practice that the patient is doing, and I'm comparing and I'm exposing this population to different drugs or interventions, that should be captured in our research question. The other thing is the comparison, as we mentioned. So we are comparing drug X to comparing drug Y. So the intervention is drug X and Y, and we are comparing between them. And comparison can be in many ways. I can compare safety, I can compare efficacy, I can compare risk factors, I can compare patient perceptions or perspectives. A lot of things we can compare, even besides efficacy. And the outcome is the results of this intervention. So again, it doesn't have to be efficacy outcomes. It can be safety outcomes. It can be patient perspectives. It can be even surveys that convey the physician's practice or even their perceptions. So you have to know your population. You have to know the intervention, the comparisons you are doing, if available, of course, and the outcomes expected. So when you can collect all these answers in one title, usually this sentence is your research question. So if I say, what is the efficacy of low dose versus high dose corticosteroids in children with idiopathic nephrotic syndrome, and you can mention the outcome in terms of seizing progression or improvement or clinical improvement or proteinuria, or you can go into depth, of course, in what type of outcome that will serve your primary objective. So other examples are, as we mentioned, patient population, intervention, and the people criteria, a comparison outcome. There are patient population could be a certain disease or condition, a certain stage in the disease. I can talk about stage 2 or 3 breast cancer, for example. I can talk about severity. I can talk about, for example, rheumatic or rheumatoid arthritis. I'm going to target severe patients only. I can talk about demographics and characteristics. What are the age of these populations? So I can choose, for example, children. I can choose a certain age in men or women. I can choose the elderly. So you can control the population, and the more specific you are in your research question and the more precise, the better you get the outcomes. And again, you can talk about a specific gender. If we're talking about a female disease or a male disease, also we can be very specific. Intervention, the type of intervention or exposure, and we can determine in our research the dose, the duration, the timing, the route. So the dose, as we mentioned, for example, the low dose versus high dose corticosteroids, the duration, I can say that we're going to do it in 2 years duration. The timing, we can talk about late versus early intervention in a single or a single regimen, for example. Route, we can talk more do examples in terms of corticosteroids, oral corticosteroids versus IV or IM corticosteroids. comparison, we can compare a lot of things. It's not only efficacy, as we mentioned. So we can compare risks or treatment. We can compare placebo or other active treatment. We can compare outcomes like frequency, risks, benefits, harms. We can talk about mortality, morbidity, quality of life. All that are outcomes we can also include in our research question. So, one of the most important things is that you turn your question into a proposal. And when you turn that question into a proposal, you have to have certain criteria besides the PIGO criteria, and we call it the final criteria. So your question has to be feasible, and it should include an adequate number of subjects, follow adequate technical expertise, be affordable in time and money, and manageable in scope. So when we're talking about adequate numbers of subjects, you can't make a big study on a small population. You can't expect, for example, to in a rare disease that you can target thousands of patients, and the other way around, you can generalize your results if you have a small sample size and you only want to target a very niche population. The same thing about adequate technical expertise. So it's very important that you yourself are an expert in this research area so you can answer the questions and solve the problems while you're going. Be affordable in time. You cannot say that my research is going to be for 30, 40, 50 years, and at the same time, I can't see the effect in 1 or 2 weeks. And also, it's affordable in money because you can't also target a very expensive drug and then say we're going to use this drug in thousands of patients. That's not going to be feasible. The other part is the I, which is you have to have an interesting idea and a research question, and you have to obtain the answer should in to be very very appealing to investigators and the scientific community. So do not look for old questions that have been answered repeatedly. If you're going to talk about does acetaminophen or ibuprofen cure headache, so this is not a new or an interesting research question. And that takes us to the end. Also, it should be novel. It should be unanswered, and you should, as much as you can, look for questions that have not been answered before. And you could also have a different approach. So, for example, I'm doing this in a certain population. So, if this is done in a certain region or studies are done in a certain region, I can convey this same research question, but in a new population. So it should confirm, refute, or extend previous findings as well. Ethical, as we mentioned, that all our research questions should be amendable to a study. That institutional review board will approve any study that has patient data should be approved by the ethics committee or IRBs. So if it's not ethical, it will not be approved, and you cannot collect that data and do that intervention to those patients. And of course, it should be relevant to scientific knowledge, clinical and health policies, and to future research to even open the door for further research. We always say that if you answer one research question, you open the door for even more than 10 new research questions through your journey. So, what does a poor research question look like? A poor research question will always lead to inconclusive research outcomes. And so make sure that the audience can clearly understand the targeted question and accepting constructive feedback. As we mentioned, it's very important to have a mentor. It's very important to have colleagues and a team and to really accept their criticism so you can learn and adapt and to change accordingly. So what does a poor research question look like? As we mentioned, it's too general. So I'm going to do a study on breast cancer. So if we're talking about all patients with breast cancer, it will be a very general research question. It's too vague that you yourself cannot explain it. If you cannot explain it or you cannot put it in one sentence that it's understood from the first time, then it's a too vague question. It's better to have yes, no. It's better to not have yes, no questions. So your research questions should not be a yes, no question. It should be more specific in terms of details. As we mentioned, if it's not important or not attractive, it will be a poor research question. If it's not testable and something that's really hard to conduct, also, this is a poor research question. And as we mentioned, if you have an already answered question, there is no use of reopening that question or re-asking that question. So, it's very important for everyone to understand how to do the research question or how to create or formulate the research question in terms of, as we mentioned, all the details and all the criteria and all using the PICO criteria and the final criteria to reach a specific question that we can answer through a certain methodology that we'll be talking about in future sessions, hopefully. So it's very important, everyone listening to this, to start applying. If you are working in a specific disease area, start applying this. Start looking for questions in your field. What can I do to answer these questions? Is the answer out there, or it would be a genuine and novel and a new question that can add to literature? And we can support in that. We can. Here's my email. Please send me if you have any questions, if you have any ideas you'd like to further formulate, would be happy to support. Thank you all, and looking forward to meeting you in next sessions. Thank you so much.